belong to Zora Neale Hurston. In this episode, Dr. Deborah Holton takes an in-depth look at the life and body of work of this Harlem Renaissance writer.
One of the things that I find very intriguing about Hurston also is, as I try to understand her in the context of her life, in the context of the social activities that were going on in the day, I'm really confounded and intrigued by what she was able to accomplish. For example, she wrote through from the Harlem Renaissance to the great stock market crash. She was writing during the Depression, and she was dependent on the kindness of benefactors, to the kindness of her publishers to help support her in these efforts. I mean, sometimes she only had one pair of shoes, but she was committed to gathering this work and engaging in it. And I just find that remarkable. She was writing through World War II, and the criticism that developed, she, as time wore on, she really faced some very harsh criticism. In looking at her work recently, I'm really struck by how much she wrote about black women and the abuse that black women put up with. Some of the characters that she gives us respond to that abuse in ways that suggest a passiveness. But there are others that take on that abuse and they manage it in ways that are very distinct. And so what Hurston has provided us with is a real picture of the lives of these black women that we might not have ever had any insight into.
He left the house hating the two women bitterly, as only we hate those we have injured. At the hotel, omitting mention of his shows of affection, his pleas, his solemn promises to Docia, he told the other waiters how that piece of earth's refuge had tried to inveigle, to force him into a marriage. He enlarged upon his theme and told them all, in strict confidence, how she had been pursuing him all winter, how she had waited in ambush time and again and dragged him down by the lake. And well, he was only human. It couldn't have happened with the right kind of girl. And he thought too much of himself to marry any other than the country's best. The worst sin a woman could commit was to run after a man. So the next day, Eatonville knew, and the scourge of tongues was added to Docia's woes. Mrs. Boger and her daughter kept strictly indoors, suffering, weeping, growing bitter. Mama, if he just hadn't tried to make me out a bad girl. I could have looked over the rest in time, Mama, but he tried to make me out. Docia broke down, weeping again. Drip, 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 went her daughter's tears on the old woman's heart, each drop calcifying a little of the fibers, till at the end of the 4 days, the petrifying process was complete. Where once had been warm, pulsing flesh, was now cold, heavy stone that pulled down, pressing out normal life and bowing the head of her. The woman died, and in that heavy, cold stone, a tiger, a female tiger, was cut by the chisel of shame. She was ready to answer the question Bo had flung so scornfully at her old head. Well, what are you going to do? Docia slept, huddled on the bed. A hot, salt tear rose to Mrs. Boger's eyes and rolled heavily down the quivering nose. Must Docia awake always to that awful desolation, robbed of everything, even faith? She knew then that the world's greatest crime is not murder. its most terrible punishment is meted to her of too much faith, too great a love. She turned down the light and stepped into the street.
Zora Neale Hurston and Langston Hughes enjoyed a very close and warm friendship. There was a one-issue collection of spectacular work called Fire. And Hurston and Hughes and other members of the Renaissance, not many, a couple others, worked on this remarkable document. Langston Hughes was an award-winning author himself. He was very prolific, writing poems. Both of them were subsidized by a woman whom Hurston calls grandmother, who really provided Hurston and Hughes the money to support them during this very difficult time of as the stock market crashed and they were engaging in their individual work. Hurston and Hughes collaborated on a play entitled Mulebone, but that collaboration broke down and something happened between the two of them that neither one really talked about.
It sort of separates Zora from Langston becomes almost impossible, given the fact they were probably the leading, or considered among most people, the leading poets and writers of the Harlem Renaissance, male and female. Although, again, their love-hate relationship is probably just as interesting because they were the best of friends and, unfortunately, the worst of enemies as well, being contemporaries and rivals. A lot of it boils down to just sponsorship of who was sponsored. Still, even during the Harlem Renaissance, of that being the height of our rebirth and the height of our contribution, most African-American artists were still sponsored by white philanthropists. So a lot of it had to do, along with Van Becken, and the sponsorship between who was getting sponsored, Langston and Zora. And the big riff really comes about during Mulebone, the play they collaboratively wrote and tried to put together, which has had some recent productions. I mean, first it was done in New York probably about maybe almost 10 years ago now at the Lincoln Center. But again, that rival between the two of them was really because of strong personalities and that whole flavor of that era and doing the green rooms and doing the forums where the poets and the writers would get together. And it really was about national attention, who was going to be the writer. A lot of it, I mean, we talk or don't talk about, had to do with lifestyle. Zora really being bisexual, same with Langston. I mean, I guess those are things that people don't like to talk about in terms of part of our history. I don't think that's necessarily a negative because that was who they were. But it certainly fed into their rivalry a lot. And Langston getting the notoriety that Zora really didn't get. I mean, Zora got a lot of notoriety during that period, but probably if you ask most people in terms of which one they know the best, whose work they know more of, Langston's going to surface to the top because it was easier to deal with, I think, in terms of personality, in some ways more acceptable. I mean, Langston being the first African-American poet laureate the country had was also important. And because Langston was a novelist, a poet, and a playwright, I mean, he sort of did cover areas. Zora was much more a novelist and a poetess than she was a playwright. So collaboratively working together did not turn out to be what people thought it was going to be with the Mulebone project. And unfortunately, that project went down. It was unheard of for a while. It never came to fruition during either of their lifetimes. So that piece was never realized to its fullest extent as a play, which could have been a major contribution to African-American theatrical literature and drama. Never happened. I mean, it never came about because of personal risk. So they fell, I think, prey to this whole divide and conquer syndrome that we still have to deal with from time to time based on artistic ego and artistic strength.
So around this play, which came out of a story that Hurston had written about a split in the black church, Baptists and another denomination. And just some of the drama that took place in that Mulebone was centered around some local drama. in the Eatonville area that Hurston captured. But their collaboration, as I said, fell through. And if you read their two autobiographies and you read their biographies, you get a better picture of what may have transpired between them. Hurston packed her Southern self up and went to the North. She didn't go to the North to assimilate into the Northern ways. Once she finished her schooling, she went back down South. Every time she could, she would go back South. She lived in her later years in the South. She was a Southern product. And I think for those of us in the North and those of her contemporaries in the North, she was an entity that was unfamiliar to them. Because her speech, if you listen to the Library of Congress tapes, for example, where she's talking, as she sings, her voice is kind of brash. It has a twang to it. It's not sonorous and sweet and lyrical. It's more gritty and earthy.
I'm part of Pro Gal, but it's a pretty well distributed blues tune all over the South. The words are not rhymed. It's the typical Negro pattern, the same line repeated 3 times with a sort of flip line on the end, and the change is in the tune rather than in the words for the most part.
Where did you pick up the way you sing?
I've known that all my life, but I've kept learning verses as I've gone around. Poor gal, long ways from home. Oh, poor gal, a long way from home. Oh, poor gal, a long ways from home. Oh, lady in jail, my back turned to the wall. Lady in jail, back turned to the wall. Oh, lady in jail, my back turned to the wall. Oh, wonder will the answer if I write? Oh, wonder will the answer if I write? Oh, wonder will the answer if I write? Oh, don't you hear that East Coast wind she blows? Oh, don't you hear East Coast when she blows? Oh, don't you hear that East Coast when she blows? Coming a time when a woman won't need no man. Oh, coming a time when a woman won't need no man. Oh, coming a time when a woman won't need no man. See you when your troubles get like mine. Ooh, see you when your troubles get like mine. I'll see you when your troubles get like mine. You mistreat me, you mistreat a marvelous gal. Oh, mistreat me, mistreat a marvelous gal. Oh, you mistreat me, you mistreat a marvelous gal. Oh, see you when your troubles get like mine. Oh, see you when your troubles get like mine. I'll see you when your troubles get like mine. I'm way down in Florida on the hole. Ooh, way down in Florida on the hole. I'm way down in Florida on the hole.
Women writers have never been given the kind of just dessert that they perhaps should have. And they've had to really struggle in this, what is particularly in theater, which is one, male-oriented, second, white male-oriented. So to begin with, if you're black and you're female, you're already working against the odds. And yet, these women have historically been extremely bold in the kind of literature.
I can understand why her work would receive so much criticism given the male dominance at the time. Richard Wright criticized her for not taking more of a political stand, for presenting what he thought was stereotypic images, but also because her work went against the social realism or naturalism in the manner that he was writing in, and didn't portray the harsh realities. And if you look at their two very different Southern experiences in their youth, it's understandable, because Richard Wright's environment in the South in which he grew up was not the nurturing, insulated Eatonville that Hurston recalled and reclaimed later in life. For Hurston, growing up in the first incorporated black town in the nation, for her, she saw black folk in positions of high regard. Black people as mayor, postmasters, teachers, preachers, shopkeepers, engaging in business. The high school, the school that she went to, I want to call it Hereford, that may or may not be pronouncing it right, but her school was supported by Booker T. Washington and followed the Tuskegee model. So self-help and independence and being able to move yourself forward these were qualities that were instilled in her at a very early age. So Wright's experience was entirely different. He didn't have those role models. And Hurston, and we know this is true of the media will put forward an individual to speak for the race. And so Hurston's experience was not that similar to the experiences of others living in the rural South. So her ideas and her life experiences were different and were not reflective of the masses of folk. So Richard Wright took her to task for her inability to reflect the realities that he saw. And still, we look at Their Eyes Were Watching God, which was really where his criticism of it, is very strong. And if you examine it now, given all that we know about the environment that she was writing about, the language that was used, the process of becoming the life pictures that she showed in that novel, it's very hard to think of that work not reflecting in some way a reality.
Ships at a distance have every man's wish on board. For some, they come in with the tide. For others, they sail forever on the horizon, never out of sight, never landing, until the watcher turns his eyes away in resignation, his dreams mocked to death by time. This is the life of men. Now women forget all those things they don't want to remember and remember everything they don't want to forget. The dream is the truth. Then they act and do things accordingly. So the beginning of this was a woman, and she had come back from burying the dead. Not the dead of sick and ailing with friends at the pillow and the feet. She had come back from the sodden and the bloated, the sudden dead, their eyes flung wide open judgment. The people all saw her come because it was sundown. The sun was gone, but he had left his footprints in the sky. It was the time for sitting on porches beside the road. It was the time to heart things and talk. These sitters had been tongueless, earless, eyeless conveniences all day long. Mules and other brutes had occupied their skins, But now the son and the boss man were gone, so the skins felt powerful and human. They became lords of sounds and lesser things. They passed nations through their mouths. They sat in judgment. Seeing the woman as she was made them remember the envy they had stored up from other times. So they chewed up the back parts of their minds and swallowed with relish. They made burning statements with questions and killing tools out of laughs. It was mass cruelty, a mood come alive, words walking without masters, walking all together like harmony in a song. What's she doing coming back here in them overalls? Can't she find no dress to put on? Where's that blue satin dress she left here in? Where's all the money her husband took and died and left her? What that old 40-year-old woman doing with her hair swinging down her back like some young gal? Where she left that young lad of a boy she went off here with? Thought she was gonna marry. Where he left her? What he done with all her money? Betcha he went off with some gal so young she ain't even got no hairs. Why don't she stay in her class? When she got to where they were, she turned her face on the bander log and spoke. They scrambled a noisy good evening and left their mouths setting open and their ears full of hope. Her speech was pleasant enough, but she kept walking straight on to her gate. The porch couldn't talk from looking. The men noticed her firm buttocks like she had grapefruits in her hip pockets. The great rope of black hair swinging to her waist and unraveling in the wind like a plum. Then her pugnacious breasts trying to bore holes in her shirt. They, the men, were saving with the mind what they lost with the eye. The woman took the faded shirt and muddy overalls and laid them away for remembrance. It was a weapon against her strength, and if it turned out of no significance, still it was a hope that she might fall to their level someday.
The stereotypes were very strong. And so the distinctions between those stereotypes, what would be considered stereotypical at the time, I'm sure it was just a sore spot for many people. There was a tremendous campaign, for lack of a better word, a tremendous overshadowing of the real achievements and accomplishments of black people by these stereotypes. Jim Crow, which the name was coined from a theatrical minstrel show and dance that was incorporated into the dictionary by the end of the century, that became a symbol of segregation practices. I mean, just from this popular, this very popular form, because we didn't have television, we didn't have radio, theater, and musicals and things like that were really the way in which that popular information was disseminated. That kind of overwhelming view of blacks took hold. There were some writers, white writers, who could not help, regardless of what they said their best intentions were, couldn't help but fall prey to those stereotypes as well. Birth of a Nation, the film, I believe, was first presented in 1915, I want to say, and that held the stereotypes in full relief. You had the black brute, you had, in the depictions of the newspapers, you have the mammy, you have the dandy, you have all kinds of images, despite the fact that we have doctors, we have lawyers, we have teachers, we have politicians, we have people who are making tremendous achievements. So Hurston's work is in that, and her behavior presented, as I said earlier, a real problem for people because, one, they weren't immersed in the culture in the way that she was, but they were very concerned that she was, playing to this white notion.
His righteous sentence